So a short introduction first on our two guests. Pooja is a searcher and a feminist legal expert practitioner. She specialized in women's rights, specifically violence against women and gender discrimination and law. She's focusing on the implementation of laws relating to women and on law reform. She's worked on sexuality, LGBTI rights, and works a lot on law reforms on sexist violences, gender, sexuality, and intersections with social justice. She and Carrie as well are both members of the Sexual Rights Initiative that's at the UN Human Rights Council, where the partners advocate for the inclusion of sexuality and sexual rights in a resolution including sexual orientation and gender identity. On Carrie, well, she's a feminist and gender activist. She's worked on violence against women in the human rights sector, and she's an advocacy advisor at the Sexual Rights Initiative, as I just said. Since the end of the 1990s, she's been involved in topics such as HIV and AIDS, sexual orientations, forced migration, and economic justice. She's got an academic background in adult education, politics, and applied linguistics, and she's committed to the transformation of society, among others, through creative arts, transformation that will result in the realization of constitutional rights and guarantees. I'm now handing over the word to our guests to introduce themselves and start the panel. Carrie, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay. Is this on? Yes?
I think so, yes.
Okay, great.
Close enough.
So, good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here. I just want to say that I didn't travel all the way from South Africa. I wish I had, because it would mean I'd been at home. But in fact, I'm now living in Geneva.
Oh, all right.
And I think it's the same for Pooja, so we both find ourselves here. I think, so what we wanted to do, let me start with a little bit about what we thought about for this session. We really wanted to disrupt this kind of approach of, like formal presentations and so on. So we thought we'd take a couple of questions and see how we can both answer those questions and hopefully draw you into the discussion as well around this. And I think for me this is really important because I'm so aware of the fact that being here only for the last, I think I've been here maybe 8 months or 9 months, that this is such a different context. And that while I want to really share with you what I've learned from working in these struggles in South Africa and then also in Southern Africa a bit, it's really important that I don't think that necessarily all of that applies here. And I think there are very good reasons why that wouldn't be the case. So that was partly one of the things. So we're going to try and answer these different questions. And maybe just to start, I think it's really important also for me to situate. I feel like it's really important, it's a feminist act, to situate myself. So as a white South African who grew up during apartheid South Africa, this is particularly important to do. And so just to say that my sort of work in different struggles and in different movements has had to consciously and deliberately challenge the ways in which apartheid South Africa shaped who I am in the world. And it's a process that I continue to have to do every day. And of course it's really kind of interesting also to think about my whiteness in Europe, which is where I find myself now and what that experience is like and how that is different to what I know. So, I mean, really my sort of own struggle history started in some ways quite exceptionally in the sense that my parents were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, which meant that I, unlike many of other white South Africans, were trying to sort of attack the system wherever it presented itself. And I sort of, I was quite fortunate as well in that I was able to go to a public school that was actually multiracial, which in the 80s and the 90s had not been the case. And so as soon as I sort of left school, I got involved in the sort of popular education movement in the country. And from there, sort of almost inadvertently got involved in the formal, what was emerging as a LGBT, actually, let's be real, it was a gay movement. And as lesbians, we were trying to kind of elbow some space in there. But really, in those days in the 90s, it was really a lesbian and gay movement. And a movement that was taking advantage at the time of the fact that there was a constitutional reform process. So this was mid-90s, and we managed to use the courts and a sort of general wave of this open sense of openness and possibilities to try and secure what was then a very liberal agenda, in fact, of sort of decriminalization of same-sex conduct and all the way through. And I was really active in that movement, and I always say that I'm much better now. Because it was quite clear very early on that this movement was really not interested in changing the material conditions of queer people, the majority of whom were black and poor and women. So it continued to reflect what was then, important to largely white gay men. And I left that movement very disillusioned, seeking out a sort of more feminist space, and that took me into the violence against women sector and movement. And in turn, finding that also quite limited. In its kind of relentless focus and deliberate disconnect from individual and interpersonal experiences of violence in the form of sexual violence and domestic violence, from the structural conditions and the structural violations and so on. Ending up from there in the 1 in 9 campaign. This is like becoming a very long introduction. Sorry about that, but like ending up in the 1 in 9 campaign, which we started because the then deputy president of the African National Congress, the Liberation Party, raped a woman who was also a friend of ours and an activist, a comrade. And we watched how the left movement, which we were aware of all along, systematically discredited her and the comrades who spoke out about their experiences of sexual harassment and violence within the left movement. And then sort of, stayed involved in some of that work, and then ended up within a regional organization back in sort of, what appears on the surface to be identity politics, but in fact was more a standpoint around sexuality, and then to Geneva, which is a very strange transition, and I find myself right in the heart of this monstrous thing called the United Nations. And I'm still trying to figure out what that means, and how can one even be subversive within that space? I can't, I don't know. When my friends challenge me on what am I doing there, I say I'm taking a break. So that's sort of like, that's who I am, and as I say, I'm constantly, I feel like all these experiences and so on, I sort of got to a point of understanding those within my specific context within which I was living and working, and now suddenly I find myself here having to re-explore all of that, and what does that mean here?
Okay. So here, is it this mic I'm gonna give?
Thank you, and it's a bit tough to go after that, but I will try. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and also special thank you to the interpreters for doing this from the morning. So thank you very much. And also just to, I have not come all the way from India. I would be at home. So I also live in the, for me, rather weird city of Geneva currently. So working at the Sexual Rights Initiative, the coalition. And just to introduce myself, and which will probably also define what I'm going to say. A lot of what I will probably talk about is the confusions and the constant discussions that we have internally or in my head, and I thought there is an opportunity to have more people help me figure this out. So, and I'm just going to put those questions back so that it can help me figure some of these concepts out. And I mean, to kind of say how I came into this, I am from the south of India. I came into the feminist movement coming from growing up in a rather smallish town with a very conservative family history background, looking at generally how women are treated in the sort of, well, my rage on religion also comes from there, but women are treated within the larger religion context and where women are put in. And then growing up, law is seen as this panacea for all ills, and it's going to give everybody justice. And moving into studying the law and this fabulous idea of human rights that we study, and then I started working around violence, particularly domestic violence and sexual violence. And I think some of it came similar to what Carrie said, it was to understand how inadequate the law was and how little it could do to women who are facing violence while you're in there, and doing sort of legal and non-legal work with that, and to understand that really we're not going to what is the root cause of it, which the feminist movements being associated with it sort of help, but and then part of that critique about the law, which I talk a lot on, came from there about how little it can do and how much it is valorized, at least for a lot of our context. So hence my question of where I come from. And then also working around violence to understand that the particular way sexuality is always seen as something to be fearful and what that meant, and then to move into work around sexuality, and then getting involved in the sexual and reproductive rights movement, and then also seeing the links of what that meant, what was sexual and reproductive rights, and was that really any better than how we understood the law, and how it's seen as the panacea for all ill, but we're not going into the root cause of the socio-economic, political, material conditions of women and girls across, I mean, at least in the context I come from. And now I am working with the UN around human rights and sexual and reproductive health and rights, and trying to figure out how it is that we can bring some of those movements in here, and how do we then look at what it means to be in the city, in the country, working with the UN, and then how do we understand the slightly varied experiences that does come in when one is situated in the city, from at least where I came from, which was India and a bit of South Asia work. Sorry for the long introduction.
Okay. So we were thinking, like, one of the first questions that we thought was interesting to explore was this framing of reproductive justice and how it differs from a reproductive rights agenda. I'm not sure, like, for how many of you, this language of reproductive justice, I'm not even sure how that translates into French, but, for how many of you, this is a new idea. So, we thought, maybe just to say that, so reproductive justice, it is a term that was born out of and is located within Black feminist thought, mostly US-based, I think. And the idea of it came about in the 90s in response to the need for a new discourse or framework for organizing what went beyond what had been largely a polarized and polarizing pro-choice or pro-life dichotomy, right? So if you read, for instance, some of Loretta Ross's work around this through the Sister Song Collective, she affirms that the reproductive justice movement is really resting on three sort of main principles, which are the right to have children, the right not to have children, and then the material conditions to be able to do that parenting role, right? So, like, this is sort of in a sense, but of course it also means much more than that, because it not just draws attention to this as a kind of end goal, but it also implies a particular way of doing struggle. It's an approach, so it's not just an end goal and so on. And I guess because it opened up this whole new terrain, it also meant that there were able to be new voices brought into the area of reproductive politics. And it also sought to center reproductive freedom for all as central to the realization of universal justice. It challenged the politics of inclusion, to the politics of leadership. I think this is a really important point. When I hear a lot of language around inclusion, diversity, and so on, for me, what I always hear when I hear that is, like, we're going to keep everything the same and we're just going to, like, sprinkle in a few people. So what this tried to do was to say that profoundly to disrupt this. And as such, reproductive justice was and remains and should be a challenge to white liberal feminism. So it differs from this reproductive rights, this sort of discourse, in very important ways. Some of these. Okay. So, I think these are just some of the ways, and I think Pooja will add as well. So the first is the ways in which reproductive rights is conceived of course within the wider human rights framework. And itself, human rights itself is a contested and challenged terrain, and it should be. Because it's problematic in how it reinforces individualistic, capitalist and neoliberal ideas. And both in its application, its co-option, and also its instrumentalization. And we've seen over time that the human rights discourse names some things as rights violations and others as corporate expansion, as protection of the environment, and so on. And in an increasingly familiar pattern, human rights are the very basis upon which wars are waged, natural resources are appropriated, and we only have to think about pinkwashing and greenwashing as examples of how this has happened. It also places rights holders in direct relation to duty bearers, so it reinforces the relationship between the state as responsible for the respect, protection and fulfillment of these rights and those claiming their rights. And in this way, it reinforces the power of the state. So it often needs advocates and rights holders to make claims for protection and greater regulation by states who are in fact responsible for the violations in the first place. And we see this. Louder?
Yeah.
And we see that, I think we've seen this in so many instances. In South Africa, you know, when we've organized around whether it's gender-based violence, and of course, you know, South Africa is well known for this. It's been billed in some places, you know, in terrible ways. We are the rape capital of the world. You know, intimate femicide, every 6 hours a woman is killed by her intimate male partner in South Africa. That is real. So, you know, so there is a lot of that. And yet, in sort of a sense of desperation, perhaps also with this sort of still romantic idea of who's in government in South Africa. These are many of our comrades there. Surely we should be able to demand of them, and so on. But so we find ourselves making claims on that state, that very state, that is sort of selling land out from underneath us. You know, that is extremely violent. That is deploying state resources against us, against the workers, you know, and so on. So I think this is really what some of the sort of rights discourse does. And then perhaps just one last point here is that reproductive rights are often advocated using the single issue, right? So it's abortion, or it's contraception, or it's maternal mortality. And many times these priorities are actually dictated by outside forces, whether those are donor funding or multinational corporations through the medicalization and pathologization of various aspects of reproduction. Through the racist northern international NGOs who follow in the steps of white missionaries very often. And so while reproductive violations and the denial of bodily autonomy is of course a concern all over the world, and it's important not to erase or undermine women's ability to articulate these denials and violations, it is often the why they occur, so the sort of thinking behind that, how to address them, and even the desired outcomes that is most often differently articulated. And I think that, you know, another sort of element of this is the ways in which our movements have become populated and led by professional activists like myself, for example, or lawyers and others, academics, and so on. And so the ways in which even the struggle has changed in who's in there and who's leading it, and so on. So yeah, I think I'll stop. Maybe just to illustrate this a little bit is, you know, like in South Africa, so one of the things that we managed to do, similar to how I was talking about this sort of, this moment of the rain, you know, we called it the Rainbow Nation. I mean, I'm just like, oh. The Rainbow Nation. So this is like 90s euphoria, you know, apartheid has, at least on paper, being defeated. Right, the ANC, COSATU are in a trap, which is our biggest trade union in the Tripartite Alliance. They're leading the country. And as part of this wave of change, we managed to secure the right to abortion. And I think it remains one of the best versions of the law, right, that we have in the world. And so while that's really great, now 22 years later, we learn that illegal and unsafe abortions are on the rise, and perhaps are even higher, at a higher rate than they were when abortion was only available to white women, which is what the situation was in apartheid South Africa. And that the public health system is only functioning at 40% of its capacity in terms of provision of abortion services. So, you know, I think one of the things that women tell us all the time is that you can't eat the Constitution. Right, like you can't eat the abortion law. The abortion law itself is not going to help you if there hasn't been a wider change that underpins that, and if your own material conditions have not been profoundly altered. So I think that sort of will be my first attempt at answering that question. Pooja?
Thank you, Carrie. I will try and build on some things Carrie said. Some of it might seem like a repetition. Do forgive me on that. But just, I think, a slight deviation from it, at least for a lot of us who started working, was also to locate reproductive rights, the term, as also something that was coined internationally, at least in the multilateral, the fabulous, not so fabulous UN place, so to say, multilateral arena. It did come from feminist counterpositioning to how population policies in different parts of the world were coercive, be it on how women's bodies were regulated to control populations, so that So that, we have the right level of population coming from India. That has been the history, and it hasn't really worked in many ways, if we can say that. But it's also because then the women didn't have the option of saying how and what happened to their bodies, and these coercive population policies, be it the single child norm in some places, or what kind of targets were being put. And actually in a lot of our countries, the abortion laws came into place as a way of controlling population. So women have had access to abortion, if we look at it as a single issue, because there was a need to control population. And whether it be post-conflict in some reason as to how to control it, or just the sheer worry of overpopulation. So it did come as a counter to reframing things in a way where human rights are respected. And at that time, it was quite it was really big and radical in its own way. But I mean, now when we see it going by, reproductive rights has also been used and has become a single issue, and it's also individualistic. Also in terms of who can access it, what does it mean? I mean, 10 years down the line, there might be somebody else sitting saying reproductive justice was seen as radical, but it's not. So we also know that is how the evolution happens. So hopefully that's how it works. One of the problems that we also see within the idea of reproductive rights inherent to it is the idea of the so-called choice, which women have in having this or exercising it. And I will come to choice a little bit more later in terms of the contradictions within it and how it kind of plays out in what we see. But for now, it's one of the things, and access to rights then became like a choice. Who has what choices you have, what right you want to access, the whole gamut. And there has been a lot of work that everybody has done. And in some ways, the language of rights, who accesses rights, especially now, generally presumes this idea that everybody has the same economic, social, cultural, political resources on what rights we have, how we access it, how we use it, how we don't use it. And it really doesn't go to the structural causes. And it centers the law as the redressive mechanism, the courts as a way of accessing justice, where we all sort of know courts can do some bits. They can implement the law, but they don't necessarily are the avenue for women to get justice. And one of the things it also does is it erases the impact of patriarchy completely on how patriarchy has played a role in what these laws are, how these laws are framed, how these rights are seen, who accesses these rights, and it erases the idea of patriarchy completely. And also, given the fact that in a lot of our countries, the law was based on systems on structures created by the colonizers, whose single most idea was, let's control the populations, let's keep them subdued. And we inherited the same laws, we inherited the same rights. There is an arguably good argument to say that entire human rights framework was a northern concept based by the colonizers, when a lot of us are from, weren't independent sovereign nations. So then the idea of reproductive rights, which is coming from as Carrie had pointed, the neoliberal idea of human rights, then makes it a very individualistic and doesn't go to the structural causes, which we both kind of spoke about. And then for us, reproductive justice, at least for me, reproductive justice reframes the issue into a feminist project. It's not an end goal, it's not a tool, it's not one single thing. And I think today morning people were talking about the strike being a process, organizing it, continuing, and reproductive justice then becomes a project, a continuous process. And it also takes into account that we are all not the same, we all don't have the same histories, we all don't have the same backgrounds, we all don't have the same experiences. So in a way, justice might mean very different from what it might mean to Carrie. And to understand to understand that justice means different to communities, which is also a huge site of violations. And then to look at what, for a lack of a better word, holistic. It's a problematic word, but I don't know what else to say it at this time. but then take into account the various class, race, caste coming from India, and then look into organizing around this project of women's bodies. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. So as we were discussing, we thought we'll do it into these questions so that, at least some of us don't go into a rant. So one of the things we also looked at is, what does reproductive justice promise? And what is the problems it's addressing? I think we sort of looked into it a little bit, and what does it look like? I think, now just for a change, I'm going to go first and then Carrie's going to go next. But, and here we were, one of the things I wanted to talk about was this idea of reproductive rights and what choices women have, and what choice, the idea of choice. And we see that a lot, the pro-choice and the anti-choice movements across the world, particularly in terms of abortion, when we talk about abortion and what that means. But the idea of choice, which in a lot of the times comes from a individualistic neoliberal perspective of who has what choice, assumes everybody is the same, everybody has the same resources. So then all of our choices are the same, and then we make this very responsible, it's upon us to make that responsible choice of using one versus the other, which, as everybody here probably has already done a lot of work on, is not true. But at least in some of the work that we are doing, problematizing choice has also meant co-opting a certain patriarchal, racist, and also neoconservative approaches of then how we conceive of people who don't have all the choices that everybody has. And I think in here I'm going to use this example from this fabulous author, and then talk about how, at least in the way natural birth, breastfeeding, and how that has there is a particular connotation of that, and who can access that and who cannot, and what it means to have this idea of a woman who's going to use natural birth mechanisms only, and breastfeeding as the ideal. Now, to also then contextualizing it, one of the reasons that did come into place was to counter what Carrie said around over-medicalization and over-pathologization of women's bodies. The health sector did use women's bodies into this whole thing where they can test all kinds of medicines. The profit-making enterprises went crazy about just the amount of profit they can make by giving women, telling them how they should experience pain, how they should experience childbirth, how they should, it's a lucrative industry, which did look at how delivery, and particularly around reproductive labor, if I can use that term, and it came from problematizing that to say people don't have the right to say how women did. And then there is a history around how the UN bodies talked about this as, that there was a definition of then what is a natural birth, very medical terms, which I don't really understand, but it is a factual thing of so and so should happen to your body, and yes, there might be ways to do breastfeeding. But then over time, and this has particularly happened in Europe and North America, that this became the end goal. This has become the ideal way of how women should be. This idea of what is normal, and the normal is that as women we love giving birth naturally. There is this whole idea of how this pain is useful. I think there's an entire area of work which talks about how it helps bonding between the women and child, and that has become the ideal. Now it's not about what is factual, it is what all women have to aspire for. From a critique which came as an anti-capitalist, anti-demedicalization critique, it got actually co-opted by the neoconservatives and the neoliberal agenda to make it the ideal. And now you have an entire industry of large money around the kind of services that is available, like large money. And I'm trying to find my so that there is apparently about $2 trillion US industry around the idea of the baby boomers, baby bloggers. And the last conference which was sponsored around this was sponsored by the Hewlett-Packard, Disney, Lego, 20th Century, Johnson & Johnson. This is the industry that co-opted what was essentially a feminist critique of what medicalization was doing to women's bodies. And then now we are located in this, and keep this at one side, but also at the other side, who are the people who could access these kind of natural delivery. There was a class differentiation, there was a race differentiation, there was also an entire gamut of who can access it. It's women who are generally privileged, upper middle class, white women in particular countries who could say, yes, I can make the choice of having a natural birth, right? I can do breastfeeding, I don't have to go to work, I can do all of that. At the same time, in countries like India, where I'm from, where there were very high maternal mortality rates, the movement was to some extent pushed by it, was also pushing towards institutional delivery and not home delivery, and not using the traditional birth attendants, which also, and then there was also a push for that, and there's problematizing that as well. So this idea of then choice, problematizing choice, but then actually looking at reality, for me the question has always been, how do we nuance this, how do we advance it, and how do we address the co-optation, and how do we address the various racist stigmatizing judgments that come around this. And similarly, the range of contraception services that is available now is tremendous. A lot of them driven by big pharma industries because it's a lucrative business. But at the same time, having access to contraception in many countries has done great, has helped women a lot in looking at how their sexuality means. The morning after pill did great stuff, but at the same time it came with strings attached. So then the question is always, when we are organizing with the neoliberal, neoconservative agenda, co-opting everything, how do we continue critiquing it, but also at the same time, how do we look at restructuring? I mean, how do we break down the structures so that this, and then how do we continue co-opting it, stopping the co-option, but also taking our own idea of the original reproductive justice agenda that Carrie had spoken about when she gave us the history. And finally, my last question, which I was hoping to get more, is then how do all of us locate with the advent of assisted reproductive technologies and what it has meant for women. In some, there is a caste of who can access assisted reproductive technologies, but then, and it's also driven by huge medical agenda, pharmaceutical pathologization, medicalization. But does that mean then we say any advancement is a problem because it's driven by a neoliberal agenda? But it also has the potential to break down patriarchal understandings of marriage, kinship, who is a woman, who's not a woman, who's a good mother, the entire idea, the feminist idea. So then what do we do? Then how do we look at these things are some of my questions. Sorry. As I said, I'm going to ask questions which I'm thinking about. And it's too long.
I actually feel like that I have nothing really to add to that. And so maybe it's a good time to sort of open it up if we can do that. Yeah.
Gosh, I don't even. Let's see. I probably am just going to say yes to a lot of the things that have been said, and yes, that's it. Maybe just a couple of things. I mean, this thing of how can the work in the UN ever really be disruptive, subversive, and so on? I don't know. I mean, everything up to this point would tell me no. But I mean, clearly, if I'm here, it means I'm going to see what the possibilities of that are. Look, I think that what many of the partners of the Sexual Rights Initiative would say, and it's important to say that the partners are a mix of organizations working in and based in different regions. So we do have two partners that are sort of North American and European based, but the rest are coming from Global South countries and regions and so on. And I think one of the things that they've said repeatedly is that we also need to look at the UN as a space of ideas, and that if they are not, if our ideas are not there, then it's sort of it becomes this uncontested space, right? What that means, though, in real terms, and what the costs of that are, is really high as well, right? And so, of course, how individual activists from the Global South experience that space is also an important thing. In terms of the absolutely overwhelming racism in that space, the ageism, etc., like the ways just on an individual level one experiences that, as well as then the more sort of institutional nature of that space. So I think one of the things that the Sexual Rights Initiative tries to do is to show up where they are, where some of the more progressive, seemingly progressive rights claims are actually collapsing into the neoliberal agenda. I think that's one of the things that we try and do, and maybe later on a panel later we can talk more about that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's we in fact in the office we were just talking about this yesterday, like what on earth are we doing in these spaces, right? Like what on earth are we doing then? How do we make sense of it? I think one of the things that we've tried to do is also to talk about like what is our relationship to movements outside of the space, because I think this is the only way to sort of keep ourselves in some way aligned with some of the demands that are happening outside of that space. And I guess as an allied point, perhaps, and something that I've been thinking of as well is the ways in which the language and so on is also itself exclusionary. So I think this builds onto your point around how women will often describe their lives in terms that exclude the theoretical constructs and ideas that we perhaps have access to. And in South Africa, this is a very important issue, and so many people will actually challenge when one is using more theoretical concepts and so on, right? And it does point to a sort of class thing. But I think, again, it's also important for popular movements to also have access to sort of theory, because I think that theory cannot be the domain of the privileged few in institutions of power and so on. And so one of the things that we have done in various movements is to have a conversation about Butler. So what does this mean? And that means we have to read it slowly and we read it together, because it's like it makes no sense in the beginning. But in the end, there's something very powerful about activists who perhaps have been denied the opportunity to finish school, being able to use this back, right, to speak back to power on that. So I think that's one thing. And then, I don't have much to add in terms of the sort of slum dwellers movement, or Abahlali, the landless people's movement in South Africa. But just to say that the question of land, of course, is a central one. And it's one that is increasingly becoming the sort of basis on which movements are being mobilized and organized. Because the reality is that in South Africa, nothing has changed in relation to land ownership. So land ownership remains in the hands of white capital, and people are increasingly pushed to the periphery of that, and the little bit of land that people had access to, communal land, is very fast becoming expropriated by multinational corporations, which the state is complicit in doing. So I think that the question of land and how that it will remain a very central issue in all the struggles and movements in South Africa. And how women experience those struggles, I think, is also really interesting and important, because what we see in many of these movements is that women are at the forefront of these movements, and yet these movements are also the sites of incredible violence. And so we've seen time and again where women comrades speak out against sexual harassment in these movements and sexual violence in these movements, and then are accused of being traitors to the cause. They're pushed to the outskirts and so on. And so I think there's incredible work that is being done under very difficult circumstances around this. But I think, and maybe just to end here, I think one of the things that's been really useful about these movements has been that they really disrupt this narrative that South Africa has got it all sorted out. I think now, 22 years later, people are not as sort of hoodwinked by the Mandela story, right? But nevertheless, it still has some traction. I mean, we have Gandhi here on the wall, But I think that, and I think even now, so we moved from this transition of having Jacob Zuma, who was a rapist, in power, but who was positioning himself on the side of people's struggles and movements, in opposition to the former president, Thabo Mbeki, who was an AIDS denialist and resulted in the genocide of millions of South Africans because he refused to see that HIV led to AIDS and that needed treatment, to having Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the new president, who, let us not forget, was complicit in the murder of striking mine workers in 2012, possibly the worst post-apartheid, once we'd moved to transition, one of the worst sort of massacres that we'd seen. And so, under this new sort of leadership of Mbeki, this sort of the glossiness, you even hear him talking about human rights all over again, and positioning South Africa in the forefront of this. Meantime, we know that, large sectors of sort of the public resources are being privatized as we speak. We don't need to talk about the anti-migration sentiment, and how that's playing out again, waves and waves of violence against any brown migrant in South Africa. So there's a lot of work to be done, which more begs the question of why I'm sitting here and not there. But I think I'm going to pause there. I mean, Pooja, can you answer the tough questions?
I was worried somebody's going to say surrogacy, and it happened. But I think one of the things that we are also trying to talk about is the idea of altruistic and commercial surrogacy. The distinction is often not the most accurate distinction, because there is probably as much or sometimes more. There is the idea that there is no coercion when one talks about altruistic surrogacy, and that happens only when somebody is getting paid. I think it is a problem, because we all know that coercion exists within family and community settings. And at the same time, if we really look at the idea of giving birth as reproductive labor, then surrogacy is reproductive labor. And yes, it is a transnational issue. There are issues around what needs to be regulated, if it needs to be regulated, how it needs to be regulated, where are the protections necessary, how payments are made. But if we sort of look at this as women's labor, then the idea at a theoretical point of view that a woman is getting paid for her labor shouldn't be that much of a problem, except, taking Paola's point, who I can tell you has a lot more to say on this than she's pretending she has. But that it does need to be looked at with a little bit more, looking at what bodily autonomy means. And if we see this as labor, then what are the necessary conditions that makes this a safe labor practice at the end of the day? And what are the, and then how, if we look at transnational labor, what does that mean? And what are the necessary conditions? Instead of saying, because a lot of the issue with surrogacy is always seen, comes from, a lot of the arguments against surrogacy comes from a neoconservative agenda of this, who is giving birth to whom, whose child. There is a particular conception of what the woman is, whose child, who's not child, who is a good woman. And unless all of that is disrupted first, and then we talk at some level, about going back to who has the right to have children and who doesn't have the right to have children, and what kind of families then are we privileging by saying some sort of labor is not labor and is always... I'm not saying that the practice in its implementation is not exploitative, but that we can say about pretty much every workforce in the world, right? Every kind of labor practice can be exploitative unless we look at it as labor and unless we look at it as how it needs to be protected. So that's kind of how some of us have been approaching surrogacy. I'm happy to listen to other opinions. Structures, yes, thank you very much. I think it's a point taken. I think especially working at the UN, we're sort of guilty of taking that shorthand and saying structures just like that, because it's at some points just easier. And it's a problem, and I think we're guilty of that, and not going at it in depth and not looking at how the reproduction of structures and how it reproduces sexist and racist ideologies where we come from. So thank you very much for that point. And I think for us it also needs to be, as Carrie said, what it means to go beyond the little, this bubble that sometimes UN creates, and actually go beyond and talk to outside that bubble. Sometimes you get stuck in that bubble, and then it's a problem that you need to tell yourself, look, a lot of what the stuff you're doing is stuff that's been said by movements ages ago. So don't kid yourself that you might be doing something like really big, because it is always catching up. It's always catching up in some way, depending on where you are and who you are. Have I forgotten any other question? The question on, are women in India protected? India does have a lot of good criminal laws, and I think the law has protected, but I would like to ask the counter question of, do women need to be protected, or women's rights need to be protected and their freedoms need to be protected? So as a woman from India, I don't want to be protected. I want my freedoms to be ensured. And that is a process that's ongoing, I think, in all the parts of the world. And the Western media does portray women in India and violence in India, which I'm not denying happens, in a particular way, which comes from the crazy brown man attacking the crazy brown women, because all these brown men and all these brown women need to be protected. And that is not necessarily true. And I think there's a very vibrant feminist movement in India, which is working a lot. And yes, it's a work in progress, pretty much like it's a work in progress, I think, across the world. And yeah.
I suffer from a really bad memory as well, which means I should probably take fewer questions and answer them faster. So sorry. I don't know if so let me give some sort of answer to this, and maybe you add to see if I need to add to it. Look, I think one of the things about the UN is that what we've seen is it's been a sort of site for what I call the global gaze. I want to put a trademark and CC it, and so I think there's a lot of talk in the UN about LGBT. So this is the language. It's LGBT, or it's sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is the language. But if you actually look at what is the content in there, it's a complete flattening out, right? It's this one singular sort of identity, and it's the same. And what we know then is whose identity is that? Well, it's sort of privileged white gay men living in the global north, right? That's the sort of story of it. And yet states feel like they can tick a box. So this is like the sort of homo-nationalism idea, or the pinkwashing idea. It's like they get to say how brilliant they are, and particularly northern governments get to say how brilliant they are, and they can threaten aid, and they can do all kinds of things under the name of protecting, the poor gays in those countries. So really, it's like there's and unfortunately, too many global gay organizations are complicit with it and are prepared to go along with it. So they're prepared to approach Israel for support, just as an example, or the US, or like all sorts of things. I think we'll probably talk a bit more about this later as well, when we talk about intersectionality. But there's a real problem. I think, and it's not for me to talk about how trans activists are experiencing that space. And how they are trying to push back at that sort of homogenizing discourse, right? That's at play there by the global gaze. I do think that there's some attempts to try and push a kind of depathologization approach there, and I think they're really important lessons for all of us who are doing work around sexual rights around that. Because I think this is not the only, as we've spoken about, this is not the only sort of area where there's an over-medicalization and a forced kind of pathologization that's at play. I think it's across. So I think there's important stuff to be learned from that. And then I guess the other sort of question is how much do we want to even invest in those spaces? And what does it mean to bring something before that space? Because we know its effect in terms of like, so if sex workers, for example, start mobilizing extensively, are present in that space, what will happen to those movements? What will happen to those kind of demands in that space and the extent to which they're co-opted? So I think there's important questions about how, when and how we put things on the agenda in that space, and how do we sort of really keep them as we had initially demanded them. Yeah. Yes? Kind of. Sorry.
I think the Switzerland and abortion, the migrant women and health, I think that's the
I don't have it anymore.
Sorry, it's a problem. I don't think we took all the questions. I think there was this thing around migrant women in Switzerland. I mean, we don't do a lot of work in Switzerland. It's a problem. It's kind of focused around the UN and what the partners, what the Sexual Rights Initiative partners do. But I mean, the health system in Switzerland, I'm still trying to figure out how it works. Honestly, it's just so complicated. At least to me, I just don't understand most of the stuff. But I'm putting it back on you to say what can we do to make sure that kind of very discriminatory, see, the language seeps in no matter what you do, discriminatory practices, what can we do to ensure that doesn't happen, and then help us figure out the system as well. Thank you.
So are there more questions? I mean, we sort of wanted to move to a place of so what would a reproductive justice approach mean for organizing? So how what would that look like, and so on. And I guess, some of that has been implicit in how we've sort of spoken about, where does the demand emerge from, right? And what does that mean for our practice and so on. So I thought the way I'd talk about this a bit is just to give an example of how this is happening in South Africa. So in South Africa, we've got a sort of growing movement. It's really exciting. It's very young. It's 2 years old, maybe now coming into its third year, called the Sexual and Reproductive Justice Coalition. And it really came about because what we saw at the time was the withdrawal of some of the, and I wish they'd stayed out, but they didn't, some of the international organizations that had been sort of doing this strange mix of service provision but also advocacy and so on. So some of those had left the country because South Africa is seen as a middle-income country and all the problems are solved, and the South African government must take care of things, which also is true. The South African government should be taking care of things, but the reality is it isn't. And also the collapse of what had been before the Sexual and Reproductive Rights Initiative of South Africa. So these things had sort of closed, and there was a very real recognition that there was a need to defend the rights that had been won through the courts and the law reform, but also to challenge the significant barriers to access, right? So including that the state needed to meet its public health obligations to abortion, but to a whole range of other things, and to also ensure that black women were put at the center of the struggle for bodily autonomy and reproductive and sexual justice. And this was really important because much of South Africa's political feminist landscape was and continues to be dominated by white women with class and race privilege. And that these women have also, in some ways, opened the door to international NGOs, who also come with the money and ideologies that are very often racist and neoliberal themselves. And so SRJC's sort of point of departure then was to locate sexualities and reproduction intersectionally within a social, economic, cultural, gendered, geographical, political, racialized, age-based, ability-based, and other power relations, right? And its work since in these last 3 years have been to take on a whole range of things, from stockouts of essential medicines. So, this is a really big issue in South Africa, where you have over 2 million people on antiretroviral treatment.
Carrie, the mic. Yeah.
Sorry. So where these stockouts actually result in people being forced to default from HIV treatment, which we know has a devastating impact in terms of the ways in which they then develop resistance to, the second-line treatments and so on. but also pointing to, so some of the other work has been to point to the corruption of the state health officials and how they collude with multinational pharma companies around this. The dumping of harmful contraceptives on black women, so Depo-Provera continues to be rolled out by the National Department of Health, even though we know that it points to an increased vulnerability to HIV. Demanding abortion services be delivered as part of a basic set of health services, and that should be available across the country. And at the same time, and I think this is sort of what Pooja was talking about as well, like at the same time being able to make the complex arguments around the over-medicalization of abortion and other SRHR services. And so increasingly SRJC offers activists, so there's all this kind of advocacy work that we know of, that is more traditional, but at the same time it's been able to create a sense of community. I think this is really important. So it's been able to create a space for trans sex workers, for abortion providers, for queer youth, a community space to actually relax, to learn from each other, to connect, and also to plot resistance. I think, so, this is a really early initiative, but I think it's really informative. And what it does also is I think this is both its advantage, but also perhaps its risk, and we'll see how this plays out over time, is that it only requires people to sign up against a set of ideological sort of principles, right? So you can be located in different sites. So it sort of disrupts this idea also of where does activism take place and where does it need to take place, including making space for many comrades who are actually situated in the state now. So there's some really interesting sort of things that are happening there and how people sort that out, and so on. I think, though, there's still more important work that needs to be done in terms of drawing the connections exactly, I think, as you were saying, between how is landlessness and expropriation of land fundamentally and profoundly connected to reproductive justice. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done. But I would say that for early stages, I think that this is quite a promising example.
I don't know if there needs to be something said after in case there are like questions, because I think I would have been a little bit more vague about it and you were more concrete. So I don't know if there's anything that I want to add. It's just that it centers. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to add something. Okay, so I just want to maybe this is also a bit of a question, and I'm not sure the extent to which this has become a sort of dominating discourse here as well. And of course, we've all read, some of the great work that says that self-care is an act of warfare. Yes, it is, of course. But also this growing language in South Africa and the movements about self-care. And how self-care and wellness is just like another demand that's placed on women activists. I'm not sure if this is something that is happening here as well. Mm-hmm. No. Okay. So in South Africa, this is particularly pronounced because it's become like another way to whip women, right? It's like you must do all these things still. Mm-hmm. You must keep working in the home. You must also be organizing. You must also be in struggle, blah blah blah. But also you must look after yourself. And if you don't look after yourself, then you are like a really bad activist and feminist. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and of course it's also again become this kind of easily, this thing. It's co-opted into this neoliberal thing of like, oh, it's a nice day of, like a spa day, pampering day, and so on. And I really think that one of the things that reproductive justice can potentially do for us, and also I'm prepared to let go of that language, right? Or whatever, but is to start looking at community models of care, where it's not this individualized things. I really am interested in that and seeing how we can do that. And I think some of what SRJC is attempting to do is to do that. So it does this through recognizing abortion provider days, and so it does this through creating spaces for, as I said, for trans sex workers to come together, and disrupts this idea of individualized therapy or individualized care and so on, right? To see about what can we do really to create these communities based on love and friendship, which is such a hippie idea, but I want to return to it, I think.
I would suggest that we maybe take 2, maximum 3 questions, then we answer and close here.
As much as you want. Yeah.
It's gonna have to be maybe a 1-minute conclusion from each of you.
Again, can I just say yes? Yeah. I don't know what to add to that, right? I think it's an unfolding story for me, how to use that terrible system. Sometimes I think the best thing to do is to just go in there and sabotage it in the best way we can, right? But I guess that working at the Sexual Rights Initiative means that, and I guess what makes us different perhaps from other organizations and so on, is that it is a collective, and we are ultimately responsible and accountable also to our members, right? Who have decided that this is a space that they want to be in and that they want to disrupt. And so my work then is to remember that and to work in terms of that and deal with my own sort of internal conflict over that, right? And maybe that's the best thing. Maybe it's the best thing to have people with internal conflict in that space rather than people who just say, yes, this is great, and the answer. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what I have to say. And maybe just to end by saying it's been really, really great to have this opportunity to engage with you, because I think this is also another way that we survive that horror, is to connect with people outside of it. And so yeah, so thanks for giving me that chance.
Just to add the extremely rational and good examples that they gave, but otherwise, let's go burn the shit down. I will show the corridors. So we will show the corridors where that can be done. So yeah, on that note, and thank you very much for having us here.